The sides of this bed are made out of construction lumber and they need to be just a bit wider than a piece of 2x4, so I'm cutting it out of a 2x6. And here it just pinched a blade on me, and I can deal with that by just putting a wedge in there so it can't pinch on it. Of course, I should really have a saw with a riving knife, but this saw can't take a riving knife, so I can't just add one to it, and I don't want to buy a new one. But it's never been a problem because the mass of the piece of construction lumber is greater than the momentum of the saw. It's not that powerful, so it's never really been able to push it back on me in a serious way. Now the next one I cut had a lot more tension in it, so it pinched right away. And when I got to the end of it, it really popped apart. And once those two halves had popped apart, it was so bowed that I couldn't use that piece. It was too crooked. Now I need to attach those side rails to the legs in a way that can still be taken apart. I'm going to use this wooden drill guide to drill dowel holes into the side rails of the bed, as well as the front legs, which are the shorter ones, and the back legs, which hold the headboard. And I've marked where those go approximately so that once I start drilling, I have something to kind of guide me by, so hopefully I won't screw up where I place them. And I made that jig on my drilling machine with an XY table, which is sort of like a little milling machine. My CNC router came in really handy to hold the other end of my long bed rail. Now for the rails that go across the headboard end and the footboard end, I want holes to go into the end of those rails, and I couldn't just drill those on my drill press. So I used my slot mortiser to drill holes in there, but I had to start with a smaller bit because if I went straight to 1/2 inch, I got too much bit deflection. So first drilling with the 3/8, then switching to the 1/2 inch and drilling again. Being construction lumber, a lot of this stuff is not entirely straight. So for instance, this side rail here, you can see is bowed outwards. And I'm just gluing the support for the slats on this one. And this one is also bowed a little bit, and I'm just kind of forcing it bowed the other way with these shims on the workbench, which glued together with this will hopefully result in it being straight once I unclamp it. I glued together a 2x6 and a 2x4 to make something wide enough to kind of get this corner into the top of the headboard, but it turns out I didn't joint enough off of the pieces before I glued them together, so I have these nasty gaps, which I think I'll try to put some glue in there before I go any further. Now that headboard is going to have a panel made out of this 19mm plywood that's going to go in like that, so I need to route a rather wide slot in here. And I'll cut the bottom rail first so I can let the glue dry on the top part, and I have to do this in 2 passes because I don't have a slot cutter that's that wide. And then I changed my mind 3 passes because that final pass is just going to have way too much stick out, so I don't want to be cutting too hard. And I got a fair bit of tear out on that first forward pass, so I'm doing that final pass in reverse to avoid the tear out. No way. And here I'm looking at it going, that slot is much wider than I thought it was going to be. And looking at it, it turns out the router bit wandered out a bit. I guess I hadn't tightened it down hard enough considering how little of the bit is actually in the chuck. And it's a good thing to screw up is on the back bottom where no one will see it, because I'm not going to fix that. But my sawdust and glue in the gaps is dry by now, so I can carefully flush from that. Uh-oh. And having learned some lessons for the bottom side, hopefully the top side will be good. Alright, so that bit wandered down on me quite a bit. Oops. This is too far. So now I find myself checking over and over again if that bit is still where it's supposed to be. Just checking again. Well, I guess that router is done. That's the cooling fan pieces that came out, and looking inside, there's no blades left on that one. It was the first router I bought 18 years ago, and I guess that's that for that one. So I'm fixing this boo-boo on the front that'll be quite visible, but of course that means another wait for the glue to dry. Slows everything down. And I'm not going to clamp that because it's a bit uneven and I just don't want to squeeze the glue out. The glue is going to kind of fill the gap. And cutting out the plywood for the headboard, always awkward cutting a heavy sheet of plywood like that alone. So this is the headboard, and this bottom rail is going to have a support anchor to it for the middle of the slats, which means this is going to get pushed down a bit and we'll want to flex. This plywood being much wider is going to be much stiffer, which is to say this joint on here is going to get stressed because this will want to flex and this won't. So I should anchor these together with a bunch of dowels. And I just made myself a little drilling jig to basically go in the slot to precisely position the holes, and I'm using these drill bushings, which of course is another chance to show these off. You don't really need those for that though, because for something like these sets of 4 holes I really wanted to use those bushings, but they're 3/8 and I want to use bigger dowels. So I just made this thing and that worked out okay. And just using a flashlight to make sure my bushing is properly lined up with my pencil mark. And with the glue dry on that fix I made earlier, I can now flush trim it with a hand plane. And I cleaned it up, plus the glue from my other gap fills, by just taking a tiny slice off with a thickness planer. I want to put a bevel on the front edge right about here, but I don't have a place for the guide bearing to roll against anymore, so I have to come up with a jig to guide it off of this edge. And that would be this jig here, which kind of extends the guide bearing. I'll just set it to be level with the guide bearing. And I don't need that jig anymore. It was one-time use, but I want my metal bushing back. And if you want to know more about these bushings or buy one, see links in the video description. And adding some slot mortises to the upper part of the headboard for joining it with the bedpost. After I cut the mortises on the bedposts to attach to a headboard, I was able to glue this layer on to make the posts square. Except, look at this one. What's all this sawdust on here? Well, that is from glue, because as I glued this on just before I put the clamps on, I realized I had it backwards. So I just put sawdust on here so I won't smear the glue all over the place, and then glued it. So caught that one in time, but there's been more doing things backwards than I care to admit. For instance, these mortises, I actually cut them from the other side and they weren't through mortises, and then I realized, whoops, wrong side. So I just cut them all the way through so I can get them from this side. I'm adding a round over to the top of the headboard. I always save that sort of operation to as late as possible, so that way if I ding it up, I always got something that can rot away still. Gotta do a dry fit before I glue those posts on. Striking it with a light hammer while holding the other wedge with a heavier hammer works best. I think this might work, and I haven't got any clamps that are nearly long enough, so I just took 2 pieces of construction lumber and glued some blocks to them, and I'm using that as a clamp with some wedges. And it's my usual panic in my race against the glue setting up on me before I can't close it anymore. And that joint is fully closed. For my glue, I just wanted some non-permeable surface, so I stuck a piece of wood in a plastic bag, which turns out to work really well because I just have to pull the piece of wood out of it and the glue peels off and I can just use it again. My temporary super long clamp with just blocks glued to a long piece of construction lumber turned out to be imperfect. First of all, the wedge angle was too steep, so I cut shallower wedges that didn't pop apart on their own. Sort of like the steeper angle of a BT30 spindle releases on its own, whereas a Morse taper locks in place. But then the next problem was I just used a crappy scrap on here to glue on here, and that broke off, and this part just broke in half. So I needed to use bigger, better blocks of wood at the end of my 2x4. So with both of these broken and only one joint left to glue, I decided to do the usual trick of 2 clamps hanging off of each other. Except my longest clamps aren't long enough for this, so I used this clamp extender I made a few years ago to reach all the way, because this is almost 7 feet wide, or over 2 meters. This cap screw head fits into this hole to keep this board aligned. Now I just need to make some slats for the bed, and I need quite a lot of them, and I've already ripped a whole bunch of 2x4s down the middle for this. And I need to flatten the ends a little bit, just so they sit lower, and also because they're not all cut from pieces of the same thickness. That is somewhat more springy than ideal. I had to add an extra layer to the center support to help keep the slats in place. Let's see if that stiffens it up enough. Wow, that made a substantial difference. I already glued some blocks to the center rail to keep my slats from sliding around. But to preemptively answer a question, how does this little board make that center support so much stiffer? The thing is, if I were to double the thickness of a member, that actually makes it 8 times stiffer. So just making that center support a little bit thicker easily doubles the stiffness. So some of my slats were actually cut from thinner material, just what I had lying around, and just stepping on it here, it touches the floor, and stepping the same spot on this one, it hardly flexes at all. And it's only a little bit thicker. And putting it all together after varnishing everything, this time with all the screws and bigger screws. And these screws in the corners are just there to keep the side rails from popping off the dowels. Well, here's a cool unplanned feature. That's because I can't put the slats at the very end here because of the legs, but I forgot to take that into account when I glued the blocks on the middle rail so they don't line up. So rather than trying to tear all those out and make new ones, I just knocked out this block here, and these slats are all at an angle except for the ones in the very middle. And here it is set up. I actually built it so the king-size mattress fits in sideways, which gives us a little bit more width and less length. Because on a queen-size bed, width has always been an issue, whereas we've always had extra length.